I'm going to give you a quick review. I'll put up another formative. It's not a summative, but it kind of is a total overview of the chapter, not just a specific section. So would be what we might call a test in class. It's only 10 questions, and it will not be counted as a test, but I want you to be aware of how much you got out of this chapter. So one of the first things we can talk about is an energy pyramid. And that energy pyramid represents the amount of energy at each different, what we call trophic levels of an ecosystem. Now, the bottom energy is supplied directly by sunlight. As you go up the pyramid, there is less energy available, and that also means fewer organisms. So plants can support a large number of organisms on the next level, the herbivores, and those herbivores can support a certain number of secondary consumers, and those secondary consumers can only support a certain number of tertiary consumers. So one of the first things we have here is a level of consumers. So we would have producers, first order or herbivores, second order, third order, and also this top level is often called the apex predators. So we have different levels of consumers. Above the producers, those that eat just producers would be first order consumers. Those that actually, even omnivores would be considered first order consumers if they are at that time eating plants. So herbivores, omnivores, and then whatever eats those would be second order consumers, and then a third order consumer, and you're not going to go too much above a third order or consumer. You may go 4, but you're between 3 and 4, you're going to hit what we would call the apex predator, the population that can be supported by this particular level of producers in an area. Okay, so that also brings up the types of what we have in an ecosystem. In an ecosystem, we would start with an individual. So there would be individual apex predators, individual secondary consumers, individual primary consumers, and individual producers. Those individuals, groups of them, would make up populations. We have a population of Kentucky bluegrass at the producer level. We have a population of grasshoppers at the secondary level. We have a population of sparrows on the third level, and eating those sparrows might be a hawk. So a population of hawks at the apex. Now together, all these populations make up communities. So we have a community in this case that, as I just described, was made up of Kentucky bluegrass, grasshoppers, sparrows, and hawks. Those are all the living things in the ecosystem. Each one of those populations, each one of the individuals in those populations, and each population in the community has got two different ways it can be described. It has a habitat, which is the place that it lives. And so this particular energy pyramid, they are sharing a habitat. But it also has, each one of those populations has a niche, and that's a job to be done. So the job of the hawk is to maintain the population of the sparrows, to limit the population of sparrows. So it is an apex predator, and it does that. The sparrows eat the grasshoppers, so their job in this very narrow food chain description would be to eat grasshoppers, and the grasshoppers eat the Kentucky bluegrass, which would be their niche, at least part of their niche. We could also talk about a niche where we would have another organism that eats the dead organisms. It would be a detritivore. So the niche is more about what the organism does for the ecosystem, and whereas the habitat is a location where it lives. And within that ecosystem, there are going to be two types of factors: biotic factors and abiotic factors. So if we look at the bluegrass, that needs a particular type of soil, and soil would be considered an abiotic factor, even though there are microorganisms living in the soil and there are nutrients that are needed in the soil. As a whole, the soil is considered abiotic. The amount of water that the grasshoppers, the sparrows, and the hawk need would also be an abiotic factor. It's necessary for life, but it's not a living part of the thing. Whereas the sparrows and the hawks would be biotic factors. And many of those factors are going to cycle. And cycles come in long-term cycles and short-term cycles. Long-term cycles generally involve geology. So the material is either in rocks or stored in the Earth's crust, as in the case of fossil fuels. Whereas short-term cycles generally go from atmosphere to organism very quickly. So oxygen has a short-term cycle. Oxygen really doesn't have a long-term cycle. We don't worry too much about the oxygen that's tied up in the geology of the planet. Carbon has a short-term cycle through respiration and photosynthesis, but it also has a long-term cycle because it's stored as fossil fuels within the Earth's crust. So we can have short-term and long-term cycles for many of these nutrients that we talked about. In general, the ones we discussed were water, carbon, oxygen, phosphorus, and nitrogen. And speaking of nitrogen, we should talk about nitrogen fixation. And nitrogen fixation means going from a gas to a solid. Remember when we talked about carbon fixation in photosynthesis, we took carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which was a gas, and converted it into glucose, which was a solid. Similar things happen with nitrogen. Nitrogen is a gas in the air. It makes up most of the air that we breathe, but it's not readily available to living organisms. There are a few organisms out there that can, in the roots of plants, take nitrogen gas directly out of the air and convert it to a solid, attach it to a carbon compound, and that process is called nitrogen fixation. It's an important part of the nitrogen cycle. All right, I think we've reviewed everything in this chapter. Remember, we're relating the movement of energy through ecosystems and the cycling of matter through ecosystems. Really an extension of our discussions about energy and matter in organisms. So I'm going to put up a brief 10-question quiz, whatever you want to call it. It's not going to go in the grade book. It's a formative for your benefit only. And then next week we'll move on to a new chapter and look at how that fits in with what we've been doing all year long.